Okay. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third lecture series for the Yan Kuk-Yung Lecture in Life Sciences. And we have 3 talks, and this is going to be the second talk. The first talk has been arranged yesterday. This lecture series is co-organized together by the Chinese University of Hong Kong, mainly by the School of Life Sciences, under the Faculty of Science, together with the New Asia College. And together today, we have also co-organized this event for the public understanding of science, together with the Science Museum. So, well, what we're trying to do is to try to give you a sense, that we were trying to promote the public science, to understand that the basic science is very, very important in order to try to not only try to promote it, but the sense of understanding it is very important to develop our society. So evolution, what people have been saying that nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. So today we are very honored and privileged to have our Professor Peter Holland. I'm the Lineker Chair of Professor of Zoology from the University of Oxford, a world-renowned evolutionary biologist in the world, to give us a public lecture on about evolution. But prior to that, allow me to spend a few minutes, or probably 1 or 2, to introduce Professor Holland. So Professor Holland received his undergraduate degree in zoology from the University of Oxford back in 1984 and graduated as the top student and was awarded his PhD in genetics from the University of London in 1987. He then became a PI, which is a principal investigator back in the University of Oxford, and then promoted to be the youngest full professor in the history of UK to become a full professorship in United Kingdom. And then he moved to University of Reading. After that, he became the department head and moved back to the Department of Zoology in Oxford, and also become the chair professor, Lineker Chair of Professorship in Zoology, and also become elected to be the Fellow of the Royal Society in 2003. So he's still very young, at about age of 50. So he's been serving as the head of department in the last several years. So his research interests are very broad, mainly in animal evolution, from mice, humans, fish, mollusks, insects, which I'm not going to talk when I leave the time to him. And he has been awarded numerous prestigious awards, including Linear Medal, Genetic Society Medal, Scientific Medal of Zoological Society of London, etc., and etc. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Professor Peter Holland for giving a talk.
Thank you, Jerome. I need to change these over now. Okay. Can I just check everyone can hear me and the microphone is working okay? Level is okay? Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a great honor to be here. What I would like to do today is talk about evolution and talk in particular about the concept of the tree of life. So let's start by thinking about the diversity of life on the planet, and particularly at the moment, what I have here is some pictures of the diversity of animal forms on the planet. And we look at this diversity today, and I don't think we can help but marvel at that diversity, all the different shapes and varieties of animals that there are. But for centuries, people, scientists, philosophers have looked at patterns, have looked at this diversity and tried to make sense of it. So let's go right back in history, first of all, for a couple of 100 years in history. So what I'm showing here is an idea which was very popular a couple of 100 years ago. This is the idea of a scale of nature, where we can arrange a sort of ladder of all the living organisms. So in this ladder here, this one is from this person, Charles Bonnet, who was a Swiss philosopher, and in his version here, he's arranged all the living things. So we have, let's just zoom in with reptiles and snakes and fish and birds in a sort of ladder climbing upwards. And you'll notice that he puts monkeys and then humans sitting right at the top of this ladder. Okay? Well, I've cheated a little bit because he put angels and archangels right at the top. But now, that's not the way we think about life on Earth today, not in a ladder-like form. And the reason that I think we've sort of moved away from this ladder-like form is a much better understanding of evolution. And the person who we most associated and most associate today, of course, with the idea of evolution and with the concepts of the mechanisms of evolution is this person, Charles Darwin. Now, we're used to usually we see pictures of him as an old man with his long beard, the white beard, but actually his really important work was done as a much younger man looking like this. What you can see here in this little diagram is a sketch that he drew in one of his notebooks. He kept many, many notebooks to put all his ideas down. And in one of his notebooks, he wrote this. He drew this little sort of shape like a scrawled tree, like there, where he's come up with the idea that one species can divide into two species, and that could divide into two more species. And if this happens, then surely all living things are related in a branching pattern, rather like a tree. And therefore he's written, I'd like you to notice that, it says, I think at the top. So he's just had this insight that life on Earth can be arranged in a sort of tree. He wasn't the only person to be thinking like this. The other person that we associated with these ideas is Alfred Russel Wallace. And again, Wallace also independently talked about the idea of living things related in a tree, and he used the metaphor of an oak tree. And this is an oak tree here showing the branching pattern. He was thinking about things being related to each other. So now these two scientists who are both working through around about 1840s to 1860s came up with these ideas of the evolutionary tree. But I want to sort of step back and really think, what were the key insights that they had? And I think there were three key insights. I want to really focus in this lecture on these three ideas. The first one is the idea that all living things are related to each other. Okay, that every living thing on the planet is somehow related to every other living thing. So that you are related to a fungus, and you are related to an ostrich, and a hippopotamus is related to a flower. Everything is somehow related to each other because of evolution. So that's the first insight. The second insight is this metaphor of a tree, that we can think about relationships in the shape of a tree. So that's more of a thought experiment, that it's a very useful way to think about evolution, to think of a tree. And they both came up with that idea. And then the third thing there is a mechanism. I see we've gone 1, 2, 2 as opposed to 1, 2, 3. That's a mutation that's happened there. So they came up with the idea of natural selection, okay, as a mechanism. I'll talk about natural selection a little bit later in this lecture. What I want to do now is I want to take each of these 3 points in turn, and I want to tell you a little bit about what they thought then, 150 years ago. But much more importantly, I want to tell you about what we know today and how the science of evolutionary biology has moved on. So let's start with Charles Darwin, and let's think about the idea, the evidence that things are related to each other. Now, if you read The Origin of Species, published in 1859, about half the book is given over to trying to persuade his readership that everything is related to everything else. Okay, and he gives lots of ways of thinking about that, lots of lines of evidence. So, evidence for evolution. So, the sorts of things he used were, here he was very keen on pigeons. Charles Darwin bred pigeons, and he could see the different forms of pigeons that could be produced by humans breeding them in particular ways. And he recognized, therefore, that within this group of birds, he could see different varieties forming. So that was one of his lines of evidence, thinking, well, if this can happen with humans breeding things, maybe nature can do the same thing. That's one type of evidence. Then, of course, he went on his very famous voyage of the Beagle, this ship that went around the world studying natural history and geology and coming back with lots of ideas. And the sorts of things that, again, Darwin was seeing was related species in different places which had become slightly different. So evidence from biogeography, as we would call it today. Another line of evidence that he introduces in The Origin of Species is embryos. He looked, well, he didn't personally look, but he took evidence from other people's studies, which had shown that if we looked at the embryos of different species, and here we have fish and salamander and tortoise and chicken and pig and cow, etc., the embryos all looked very similar. And he was using this as evidence, saying, well, if they all look very similar, why should they all look very similar? Maybe, again, this is evidence that everything is related to everything. And we can extend that to the idea of homology, which is looking at the structures of, let's say, the skeleton, or indeed any other part of the body, and noticing that as we go through different groups of vertebrates here, here's a horse and a human and a bat, we can see that the bones are arranged in very similar ways. Again, it was to him evidence that everything was related to everything else. So he spent a lot of time in The Origin of Species writing about those things. But what I want us to think about is if Darwin was writing The Origin of Species today, what would he put in the book? I don't think he'd put these sorts of examples in anymore, not because they're not good examples. They are good examples, but we have such better ones today. We have so much evidence that everything is related to everything. I mean, we just think of everything we know about cell biology and biochemistry and the deep relationships of living things. If we think about how what's going on inside a living cell, of which so much has been learned in the last 30 or 40 years, with the nucleus and the DNA being transcribed into RNA, going to ribosomes and making proteins, all this machinery is the same in all living things. We see the similarities there. There's the famous double helix of DNA itself, which all life depends on. We see this now. We have the evidence that all life on this planet uses these same mechanisms. And here's the genetic code, where the individual bases on this DNA, the individual letters down here, code for particular amino acids in proteins. Again, that genetic code, the code of turning the DNA code into a protein code, is almost the same in every living thing. Just a few very slight changes here and there. So I think if Darwin was writing The Origin of Species today, he'd include things like this as evidence that everything is related to everything. Let me give you one more example, which is one that really fascinates me, which is about a set of genes which essentially tell cells where they are in the body of the embryo. So there's a group of genes called Hox genes, and here's a picture of a fly, and in these are the embryos of the fly, and in these embryos, these genes are switched on in particular places, and their job is to tell the cells where they are. Well, that's very interesting, but what's amazing is that those same genes, or equivalent genes, do the same job in us and almost all other animals. So right across this tree of animals here, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a minute, these same genes are used for telling cells where they are along the head-to-tail axis. Again, it's deep evidence of things being related to each other. Let me give you one more example. We need in our embryos that are made of cells. Those cells need to know where they are, not just along the head-to-tail axis, but also the left and the right, and the top and the bottom. Okay, because the cells need to do the right things, make the right things in the embryo. There's a set of genes, don't worry about the names. There's a set of genes in vertebrates, such as in a mouse or a frog, called the cordin gene and the BMP genes, which tell top from bottom. Okay? But let's turn this upside down. Those same genes, but upside down, do the same job in a fly or a worm. It's the same genes again. So again, the same system is being used. But what about this upside down business? Well, it seems like essentially that across the animal kingdom, those same genes are being used, but sometime in evolution, the body turned upside down. As simple as that. So I'm afraid we happen to be upside down. Our branch here is the unusual one where the body is turned upside down. So this is how we should really draw mice and fish and everything. But I think there are incredible lines of evidence to everything. All these animals are related to each other. So I said a little bit there about all living things being related to each other and the evidence for that. Let's now talk about trees. Why is the idea of a tree such a powerful metaphor? Why has it lasted so long, and why do we use it all the time when thinking about evolution? There's a couple of reasons, but let me start with the most important one. When we draw a tree, and we draw lines and branches, and we tend to draw them more like this today, rather than this one on the left-hand side. So rather schematic branches, lines that branch. These branching lines lead to the species that we are describing. Okay, so in this particular tree, we have branches coming up here to this jellyfish, a branch up here to a human, etc., with the species on the end of the branches. That's what we mean by a tree. And why is that useful? Well, compare it to a different way of thinking. Compare it to this sort of ladder-like thinking, where we might arrange species in a ladder. The problem with that ladder line of thinking is it artificially makes us think that one species that we've drawn there gave rise to another species, and it didn't. What gave rise to those species are their ancestors, which are now extinct. So the jellyfish did not give rise to the worm, which did not give rise to a beetle, which did not give rise to a human. It's their ancestors that did, their long extinct ancestors. And the tree shows us that beautifully. The tree shows us and helps our mind see that those animals are all the animals on that tree that we're seeing up here are all alive today. They've all been evolving for the same length of time. So way back in time, down the bottom of this slide, right down the bottom, they shared an ancestor, and they've been evolving for the same length of time for hundreds of millions of years. And a human has been evolving for exactly the same length of time as a jellyfish. Okay, and the tree lets us see that. Okay, that's why it's a really, really useful way of seeing how, of understanding evolution. We do the same by zooming in. Let's zoom into that tree a little bit and look at some primates. So here we have humans and chimpanzees and gorillas and monkeys. Well, the situation's exactly the same. This ladder-like thinking over here on the right-hand side gives us a false impression. The tree shape gives us the real impression that what we're looking at are living animals which have common ancestors which have gone extinct. Okay, so it's a very useful way. But there's a problem with trees. Just one problem, which is that they are very difficult to solve. It's actually very difficult to work out who is related to whom exactly. Okay? And Charles Darwin knew this. This is a very, very interesting quote. Charles Darwin wrote this in a letter to his friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, in 1857. So that's just 2 years before he published The Origin of Species. And Darwin wrote to his friend, "The time will come, I believe, though I shall not live to see it, when we will have very fairly true genealogical trees, or evolutionary trees, of each great kingdom in nature." So what's interesting about that statement? It's this bit here. I shall not live to see it. He recognized, he was only 48 years old when he wrote that letter. So he wasn't an old man, but he recognized this is a really hard problem to solve. He had evidence that everything was related to everything. He knew that a tree was a fantastic way of thinking about evolution, but actually working out precisely who was related to who on the tree was hard. Now, why is it hard? Well, let's start with some well-known animals. These are vertebrates. Vertebrates are the animals with backbones. So things like sharks and fish and reptiles and birds and mammals. Now, this actually isn't too difficult because there's a lot of structure. If you were to look inside an elephant or a bird or a reptile, you've got all the anatomy, you've got bones that you can compare, etc. You might even have fossils to help you. So it's not too difficult for the vertebrates to work out who's related to whom, to put the names of the species onto a tree. But it becomes much, much more difficult in the invertebrates, the ones without backbones. Things like worms and jellyfish and beetles, etc. Because when we look inside them at their anatomy, they are quite different from each other in terms of how their body is organized. And this meant that for more than 100 years, zoologists argued a great deal about who was related to whom across the invertebrates. They all knew they were related somehow, but precisely, is it the snail that's close to the worm, or is it the worm that's close to the beetle, etc.? Working that out was very difficult. Even more difficult than that are microscopic species. Microscopic animals, where there's almost no detailed anatomy to look at, became very, very difficult. But today it's different. It's different because of this. We have the ability to sequence DNA. What I mean by sequence DNA is we can take the DNA out of an organism, all the genes, and we can read the A, C, G, T, C, G, T, etc., of which there are millions or billions in each species. And that's very, very important information because of this reason here. Through time, these A's, C's, G's, and T's, which make up that double helix of DNA, which is the information content of the DNA, through time, mutations happen. Okay, mutations are errors, such as deletions or changes in this sequence. Now, obviously, as more time goes on, more and more mutations happen, as shown in this diagram. Now, the logical extension of that is any two species which are closer together in the tree, their DNA will be more similar. And as we go further and further apart, their DNA will be more and more different. Now, technically, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there's a lot of other things going on. But the principle is exactly that if we can sequence DNA and we sequence the DNA in the genes, we can work out who is related to whom. So, what I want to do now is give you a very, very quick tour of all the animal kingdom, the 2 million species in the animal kingdom, which have been diversifying for 600 million years. I'll try and do that in about 1 minute, but it might take 2 minutes. But it's a beautiful tree, and I really do think we know the tree today. We know the tree based on DNA sequence information. This is the shape of the tree as I've drawn up there, and I'm going to give you a little walk through the shape of this tree. And if you want more information, I did write a very short book which describes this tree. So let's start. Remember that the tree we're starting in time down the bottom of the tree, and time is going upwards. So we have branches, well, these branches on the left-hand side coming up here, these are branches that came off early, but they've been diverging for exactly the same length of time as our branch. And they lead to what we call the basal phyla. What we mean by basal phyla is that their branches came off early. It doesn't mean they are primitive in any way. It means their branches came off early. So what sorts of things are there? Well, they include things like a jellyfish, exhibit A, I'll put over there, so jellyfish. They include things like sponges down here, and some groups of animals which are perhaps less familiar to everybody. So these are the really beautiful comagellies, which are marine organisms that shimmer through the oceans. And down here is a tiny microscopic animal called trichoplax. So those are the 4 groups that make up the basal phyla. That's those ones there. Now we're going to move on to this large branch there, starting down where my arrow points to. This was a very, very important point in evolution, because that is when the evolution of animals invented a front end and a back end, and a top and a bottom, and a left and a right. Because things like jellyfish aren't arranged like that. They're much more radial, okay? But at that point, where I put the arrow, evolution invented animals to have a front end and a back end. Now that doesn't sound particularly exciting, but it changed the world. It changed the world because having a front end and a back end means you can move in a directed way. It means that an animal can have sense organs at the front end. It can have a mouth at the front end. Evolution could drive towards having a brain at the front end. It means muscle blocks. It means animals could burrow into the sediments. That changed the ecology of the planet because it started to mix up everything in the sediments of the sea about 550 million years ago. And the animals started being able to hunt. And once animals start to eat other animals by hunting, then defense mechanisms came about. So it's really sort of cascaded a lot of evolutionary events, inventing a front end and a back end. And then that branch split into 3. Now, the first one of those branches has a horrendous name, I'm afraid. It's called the Lophotrochozoa. Don't try to remember it. This is the branch which leads to things like octopus, snails, and worms. Okay? Worms are very interesting. Actually, Charles Darwin was fascinated by worms. Charles Darwin wrote many, many books. He didn't just write The Origin of Species. He wrote lots of other books, one of which was called The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. This was the last book he wrote, and it was a book he was very famous, very, very proud of writing. But it took him a long time, and in fact, as he was finishing the book, it was taking him so long, again, he wrote to one of his friends, and he said, I really hope, he was very old, he was feeling very ill, And I think he thought he was going to die nearly every day. He was a real hypochondriac. But anyway, he wrote to one of his friends and he said, I really hope I finish this book on worms before I join them. And he wrote this lovely quote here. It may be doubted whether there are any other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world have these lowly creatures. And what he means by that is that they were really important ecologically. Earthworms burrow into the soil and they mix the sediments around. They mix the nutrients around. That's crucial for making soil. And without soil, we wouldn't have trees and forests, etc. Also related to the earthworms, of course, are many other sorts of worms. So we have leeches here, we have polychaetes. Polychaetes are a type of segmented worm which live in the sea, and they're usually predatory with these jaws like this for catching other sorts of animals, sometimes rather ferocious jaws. Don't put your fingers near them. And there are the mollusks, like the octopus I just put the model of, squid, snails, clams, etc. And there's even a mollusk which is thought, which potentially changed the course of European history at least, which is in 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed to attack England, and their intention was to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. And if they had been successful, the whole history of the world may have been different. But the Spanish were defeated, and the Spanish were defeated for two reasons. First of all, the English fleet attacked them and fired cannons at them, but they were helped by a snail. They're helped by this small mollusk here called Teredo navalis. This is the shipworm. The shipworm burrows holes in ships. It eats wood. It evolved just to eat wood, trees which have fallen in the sea. And what better source of food than a ship floating through the sea? And the Spanish Armada, it is now known, before attacking England, waited in a harbour in Portugal, getting everything ready. That harbour was completely full of these, which went eating their galleons. So when they sailed to England, essentially the first time a cannonball hit them, they sank because they were full of holes. So there's an important role there that that small snail played. Then we move to this other branch there, the ecdysozoa. In the ecdysozoa, there are things like the arthropods. Arthropods includes insects, so we have there a beetle. It includes things like millipedes and spiders, crabs. So I have a few more exhibits. So here we have insects and a crab. I ate some of these for lunch. Scorpions. So they're the ecdysozoa. There's a few other interesting things. Remember, this tree that I'm showing you is a tree based on DNA sequence evidence. Without that DNA evidence, we wouldn't have known who was related to whom in this tree. But the DNA evidence allows us to go right in and work out some interesting details. For example, it had always been thought, before the DNA analyses, that the insects over here, like this beetle, were very closely related to the millipedes. So with it, and they are within the arthropods, and they are within the ecdysozoa, but how close precisely are they? Well, it now is clear from the DNA evidence that actually the insects are much closer to the crustaceans, like the crabs, and the DNA sequence evidence tells us that. So this DNA is allowing us to get real detail about who's related to whom. Other things in the ecdysozoa include these small nematode worms and very strange microscopic things like this beautiful tardigrade. Then we move on to this other branch. We live with it. We are within that branch. We're now on the deuterostomes, where we are, where we have things like the echinoderms, like starfish and sea urchins, and we have the vertebrates, the things with backbones. So let me bring a few more exhibits over. So we have things like vertebrates, like this bird, and this skate, and starfish. And we can zoom in, of course. As I said, we can zoom right into this tree to get some of the details. So let's look at the mammals, where we are. Before the advent of DNA sequence information, it was known, of course, that all the mammals were together, and it was also pretty clear that a branch came off early, leading to things like the monotremes, that's the duck-billed platypus, and co. And then a branch of the marsupials like kangaroos. But what about the relationships here of all these other mammals, the ones that we call the placental mammals? Well, actually, that was very confusing, but the DNA sequence evidence has resolved that. And we know, I won't go through the branching order, just to show you that they have branched into a number of different groups. And what's beautiful about this tree is that those groups map right onto the continents of the world as we know as they were breaking up and coming together. So very clearly here, the DNA sequence evidence is showing us which groups of animals emerged on which land masses. Okay, so I've given you that tour of the animal kingdom in terms of the shape of the tree. We can put a little bit more detail onto it like this. This is the same tree with the 3 branches, Ecdysozoa, Lophotrochozoa, Deuterostomes, and those basal phyla. But let's go step right back now. Let's leave the animals alone and zoom right out into that back of a tree, out of the tree. So we have the animals over here. We can get lots more insights. The DNA sequence data show us very clearly that we are more closely related to a fungus than a fungus is to a flower, for example. So with all those sorts of information has come. Okay, let's move quickly on now to the third point. So I've gone through the evidence that living things are related to each other and all the modern evidence for that today, and the metaphor of a tree, and again, the modern detail that we can put onto that today. But what about natural selection? Well, what is natural selection? Let's remind ourselves the fundamental basis of natural selection. Imagine each of these little circles is an animal within one species. This is one species, and these are individual animals. And then a mutation arises, a change, a variant arises. So that red one is just a little bit different. Nothing too dramatic, just a little bit different. And if that little bit different means that that animal is better suited to its environment, maybe it can run a little bit faster, maybe it can tolerate the temperature change a little bit better, it may leave more offspring and gradually will come to dominate the population. That's all we mean by natural selection. Conceptually, it's a very simple process. But what Darwin didn't know anything about was this part. What are those variants? What do we mean by a variant? Because, of course, Darwin didn't know the basis of inheritance at the time, didn't know about DNA and genes, and that's essentially what we're talking about. We know today that those variants are mutations. They're mutations in DNA, changes to the DNA sequence, and it's those mutations in genes which then get subject to natural selection and ultimately leading to the diversity of the life on the planet. So what sort of mutations are we talking about? We're talking about changes in those sequences of A, C's, G's, and T's. But what I want you to think about is to recognize that within that sequence of DNA, that long sequence of DNA, we have genes, okay? And each gene has a particular job. The whole DNA is not genes. Parts of it are genes. The sorts of changes that those mutations can do, they can change the genes themselves. I'll show you some examples. They can change switches that switch the genes on and off, control the genes, or they can even make new genes. So let's look at changes to genes. Here's an interesting example. This is work done by a scientist called Elaine Ostrander in Washington, D.C. in America, and she's been looking at the DNA of dogs and comparing the different strains of dogs. Now, this is not the differences between different strains of dogs are not due to natural selection, they're due to human selection, but the same principle applies. And what she's been able to find is the mutations responsible for the slightly different attributes of dogs. So she would sequence the DNA of different breeds and then work out the genes that differed between them. So for instance, some dogs have these sort of growths of hair on their face, which are called furnishings, but they're like having a mustache. Some have long silky hair, some have curly hair. And she's been able to work out precisely which genes have changed in these particular dog breeds. Okay, so if you see a dog with these furnishings, you know that it's got a variant in its gene called R-spondin2, for example. There is even a breed of dog which has furnishings, long silky hair, and curly hair. And that's called the Portuguese water dog. So if you ever see a Portuguese water dog, you will know exactly what sort of mutations it's got in its DNA. And there's somebody very famous who owns a Portuguese water dog, which is Barack Obama. So next time you see Barack Obama, you can amaze him by telling him about the mutations or variants in the DNA of his dog. Let's move to another example. This is Hong Kong, and if you look at these statues of fish and go to the goldfish market, you will see that they have a twin tail. Okay? This twinned tail. That's very unusual for a fish. A fish doesn't normally have a twin tail like that. So how did this come about? It's a mutation in a gene, and that's been worked out very recently. It's a mutation in a gene called cordin. So those sorts of mutations can cause those sorts of rather subtle effects. What about changes to switches in genes? Let me give you an example of that. This is work done by David Kingsley, University of California. And he's been working on this species of fish, which is called the three-spine stickleback. It's all one species, but different populations in different parts of the world have very slightly different anatomy. Maybe they're more spiky or less spiky and things like that. And he's been able to work out what the mutations are responsible for that. So let me give you one example. Here's a gene. Don't worry about what it's called. Don't even worry about what it does. It's a gene called PITX1. One of the things it does do is involved in the development of the fins. What I want to show you is that a gene like this shaded, I want you to imagine that black line going from left to right is the DNA molecule. And one bit of that DNA molecule is the gene, but then those other little black boxes are switches that switch the gene on or off in different places. Okay? And what he's been able to show is that in some of these sticklebacks, there's been a bit of the DNA chopped out and then fused back together, a deletion. A mutation has happened to chop a little bit out, which has chopped out one of those little areas, one of the switches. It just chops out that switch. Now that switch this gene on in the fins, and now the fish, which have that bit of DNA chopped out, don't have the spikiness to the fin. So there's a very precise relationship between a mutation and a variant in morphology. There are other examples, like these very famous light and dark forms of this moth, which is found in Europe, the peppered moth. That, again, that's been shown, that difference has been shown to be a mutation which regulates a gene, switches it on or off. And as I said, there are mutations that generate extra genes as well. These are the ones that I work on personally, but I'm not going to talk to you in detail about those, but we've found, we, together with many other people, have found that there's been mutations which generated extra genes on this branch of the tree just here, which is the branch that leads to the vertebrates. Okay, our branch, the branch of the animals with backbones. So a mutation happened there, quite an important mutation, which generated lots of extra genes. So these mutations, these variants, again, are something that we can actually see when we sequence the DNA. So let's sort of step back from what I've been saying and just think again about this question. Why is a tree such a powerful metaphor for thinking about evolution? Why is it an idea that changed the world? Well, I've already given you one reason, which is this one. It gave us this way, it ensured that when we're thinking about the evolution of different species, we're constantly reminded that all these living species today have all been evolving, their ancestors have been evolving for the same length of time, that we're all alive today. It's not a case of one leading into another. I've already given you that one. Let me give you another interesting part about a tree. A tree essentially is sort of fractal. You can zoom into it. Okay, so we can step back from the tree and think of the large branches up here and thinking this large branch goes to the animals, and this large branch goes to the fungi, and this large branch might go to the plants. Or we can zoom further in and we can say on this branch there's a smaller branch that goes to the basal phyla, and a branch which goes to the ecdysozoa, and a branch that goes to the lophotrochozoa. And then we can zoom further and further into that tree and say, oh, this twig here goes to the humans, and this twig goes to the chimpanzee, and this twig goes to gorillas. So the tree is a beautiful metaphor because of this zooming in, which you can do just by looking at any tree today. And then, of course, the tree also gave us a really good way of interpreting all that information about mutations, the mutations that led to those changes in different species, because it allows us to think, well, that variant which either created a new gene or changed the way a gene was switched on or off, we can place it on a tree. We can put a place where we think those changes happen. So the tree gave us a framework for biological understanding. And I think that biological understanding is essential for understanding just our own place on the planet and understanding how we are related and intimately associated with all the other species on the planet. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take this off.
Hello. So now we will come to the Q&A session. So, I mean, you're welcome to ask any questions, of course, relating to the talk, not too personal. So, any burning questions that want to fire up to begin with? Well, maybe I'll start first in that case. So, I mean, so evolution, I mean, is a kind of basic science. I mean, it's abstract, like history. I mean, so why is it still important to study evolution today?
Well, I think it's important for a number of reasons. The first, as I said, it gives us a framework for understanding life on the planet around us. And without that framework, we couldn't make the extrapolations between different species. So, for example, we wouldn't be able to do research in one species and then ask the question, how can we use that to help understand human biology, for example? So I think understanding the place of humans in the great tree of life is very important for practical applications like that. I think it's also important for, as all basic science is very important, as it gives us a critical understanding, a way of critically understanding information and organizing it. And I think approaching life and approaching the information around us in that critical way is really important for our entire way of thinking.
Well, can you give us any example? I mean,
well, examples such as, well, I mean, there are practical examples. For example, organisms are always in competition with each other, in a sense. We are faced with diseases and parasites, bacteria and viruses which are attacking us all the time. We are evolving to combat those. They are evolving to attack us. It's only by really understanding their mode of evolution can we, for instance, start to think about new types of antibiotics, new types of treatments, or even more clever ways of using evolution. So you might use one bacterium to attack another bacterium, and clever things like that. So these are concepts in ecology and evolution which are going to be very, very important to us in the future.
Right, thank you. So are there any other questions from the audience? Yes. Can someone hand her the microphone, please?
As we know that human types we had Homo sapiens and Admans and whatever like that. And why we are the only existing kinds of human nowadays? Because even a white man, black man, or Asians, we can have.
Yeah. We're all one species. Yeah.
So I want to know more about that.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question because, of course, as you're quite right, there were other species of Homo on the planet coexisting at the same time. So if you had asked that question tens of thousands of years ago, there might have been more than one. But why one today? I don't think we have a full answer to that, actually. I really don't think we know the answer to that question. We do know that there was conflict between humans and Neanderthals, for example, modern humans and Neanderthals. It seems, I think, quite likely there is evidence suggesting that essentially when that conflict was happening between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, Homo sapiens were winning the battle, shall we say. It might be too direct to say that Homo sapiens killed Neanderthals. That might be a little bit too direct. But competition isn't always as direct as that. It can be competition for resources as well. So I think the evidence at the moment, we need more evidence to answer your question. I really think it's a very, very interesting question. But I think very often when you have very, very closely related species coming together, they can be competing for resources. And sometimes they may not coexist for too long.
Yes.
There is a microphone coming, actually. So.
It would be better for the other audience.
Or I can repeat the question.
Thank you so much for your sharing and your teaching. My question is, people nowadays always say that human beings are damaging the world, and actually we are poisoning ourselves. Do you think biologically we can evolve in a way that we can get through all the pollution and survive in the long run? Thank you.
Okay, so the question really is, with all the damage that we're doing to the planet, can we as humans evolve to be resistant to the damage that we are creating? The honest answer is no. I don't think we can. I think we have to solve the problems of the planet. We have a responsibility to the planet. So I think this is an issue of timing, really. We're causing some of these problems to the planet, such as introduction of toxic chemicals, at a very rapid rate. And if we had long enough, then mutations could occur in metabolic pathways and detoxification enzymes might evolve. I don't think we're going to have long enough. So I think we are causing ecological changes at a faster rate than evolutionary changes will happen. So we have to put the planet right.
So I was wondering, since we human have many genes mutation today, I was wondering, what if 100 years from now, what will we evolve into?
Right, future evolution. It's very difficult to predict the future evolution. 100 years from now, we will be very similar to the way we are today. 1,000 years from now, we'll be very similar to the way we are today. If we were trying to look ahead 1,000,000 years, that's a different time scale. And if humans are still existing 1,000,000 years from now, which I can't say if we will be or not, there will be morphological changes to anatomy and physiology in that length of time. I really cannot predict what they're going to be. I think everybody in this room will have their own guess as to what might happen. My guess was only is equal to everybody else's. I really don't think I can say, but it will take that sort of timescale of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years before significant changes happen to, let's say, our brains or our bodies. You have to think about how evolution works. Think about how natural selection works. Natural selection is only going to work. So they're going to select the variants which change the reproductive output of the individuals. So what sort of change will change the balance of who leaves the next generation? Okay, so ideas like, oh, we're all going to have fast fingers because we use our iPhones so much. You have to think, well, are we having more children because we hit our iPhones so much? And the answer is probably no. So that wouldn't be people with faster iPhone fingers wouldn't be inheriting that, wouldn't be passing on that mutation. So we have to think like that.
Well, I have another question, because one day I read on BBC News, it says that humans are more evolved it's harder to have baby. It's harder to give birth to baby because we evolve, because we do less walking today.
Right. That sort of thing. Yeah, I don't know the data, so I'm not going to evaluate the evidence on which that. We have to be a little bit careful with news reports. Sometimes they're very accurate. Sometimes they're less accurate. I don't know that particular study, so I'm not going to comment on how accurate that is. But if that was the case, that is the sort of thing that is the sort of trait which would have an effect on evolution. Yeah.
Yes, the gentleman on the left-hand side. Where's this one?
Right on the left-hand side there.
Professor, I would like to know if your research shows there might be, your research just saying it's the evolution of animals. Does it show that plants and mammals or animals and they all have the same origin when they all evolve with time?
That's a really interesting question. It comes down to how many times did life originate on the planet? If we trace it back far enough, can we trace a branch all the way from plants and animals to meat? And the answer is yes. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, if you study the DNA, the sequence, then there might be some relationship between plants and animals, right?
Yeah.
I mean, from your research today, does it show you some trace of this kind of
absolutely,
relationship?
Yes, there's lots of genes which we have. So through evolution, so let's start from the genes that we have. We have about 20,000 genes in our body. Okay. Now some of those genes will be genes that came just in the mammals. Some will be found across the animals, but some are found right the way across, including in plants. So we share a lot of the basic genetic machinery and biochemical machinery with plants, and we can see that in the DNA. So absolutely, yes.
I mean, there's some indication that they might come from the same origin.
No, there's indication that we definitely come from the same origin. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, sorry, the gentleman on the right-hand side. Oh, can we find someone to stand on the two sides? I wish it were easier. I mean, otherwise the gentleman keep on handing microphone just to keep on running all the time.
Thank you for your sharing. My question is, someone say that the animals, the species is become extinct, and you say that there is always some new animals or new species. Do you have any numbers mentioning about is it the number of the animal or the species is increasing or decreasing?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because what we see on the planet today and what we see at the planet any time in the past is a balance between speciation and extinction. The evidence really is that throughout history, there have been periods of mass extinction where the number of species on the planet has crashed, and then more speciation happens and it can crash again. This has happened 4 or 5 times in the history of life on Earth. There is evidence, or it has been argued, that we're in the middle of one of these extinction events. At the moment, the numbers of species on the planet are decreasing, primarily through human action. So a lot of extinction is happening much, much faster than speciation is happening. So I would say at the moment, the number of species on the planet is decreasing. But as I said, it's not the first time in history that the numbers have decreased. They've decreased other times and then very, very gradually come back. So we have to ensure that, I think we have a duty to ensure that the current extinction is slowed down. We don't lose too many species, or we might find that we're one of the species that's lost.
Thank you.
There's a question for the gentleman.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Professor Holland. I think that gentleman asked a question that you thought was interesting, which is the life emerged more than once properly, but that all the living things that we have today came from one single origin. So is that something that we can find out the answer whether life did emerge more than once, and would they emerge again in the future?
That's a really, really interesting question. So just to rephrase that, all life that exists today shares the same origin. But that doesn't mean that life only originated once, because other origins of life could have gone extinct completely. I think we have no way of knowing, because those very, very early forms of life, we're talking about microscopic, pre-microscopic forms would not have left any trace that we know of in terms of, let's say, fossils. Whether they left chemical traces is something that hasn't been discovered yet. So I think at the moment we do not know whether life originated other times on our planet. We can only say that all the life today came from one origin. Will it arise again? I would argue that no, it will not while current life is on the planet, because it's had 4 billion years to do it and hasn't succeeded. So in other words, if a different origin of life starts on the planet at any time, it is immediately extinguished by current life. That would be my argument. That's a really interesting concept. So if we want a second origin of life, we need to wait for a complete extinction of life on this planet, or we find another planet and study that. Yes, there's one there.
Sorry, the lady on the right-hand side.
Good afternoon. I actually have a question about in vitro fertilization. Like, I know that many hereditary diseases are not passed on because they either cause like early mortality or they affect the reproductive ability of people so that they become infertile and the disease cannot be passed on to the next generation. However, with in vitro fertilization, those people who are originally infertile, maybe due to some underlying not yet discovered mutations, they're able to pass on such mutations to their offspring. So from this perspective and from my opinion, it seems that IVF is actually not a good invention for the whole human species. And I want to know whether there's actually any benefits from this invention. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I don't agree with you in the evolutionary angle to that. If there was, let's think about it, let's think it through one generation to the next generation. If there is a mutation which causes a particular type of infertility, and in vitro fertilization is needed to overcome that, and the child inherits that condition, the child will be infertile. So it's not going to affect evolution. Okay, so I don't think it has an evolutionary consequence, in vitro fertilization. So what it does have is a great benefit for the families who wish to have an extended family support. And of course, the vast, vast majority of people, humans born by in vitro fertilization, are normal, ordinary, healthy human beings like the rest of us, and making a positive contribution to society. So actually, I think it's a positive.
Thank you, Professor. I have two questions here. The first one is about the evolution. Is it any estimation of the rate of change? I mean, the rate of evolution.
Or the rate of change. Well, yes. There are studies where particular changes can be traced. So let me give you one example. The picture of the peppered moth, that black moth, which is the black form and the white form, which is a very common example of evolution in the school textbooks. That mutation happened about 150 years ago. So it was very recent, and then swept through the populations in Europe about 100 years ago. So mutations and evolution can be quite short scale, can happen in very short periods of time. When we're talking about larger scale changes to the anatomy, if you think about that, the example of the fish that I showed you with the reduced spines because of a mutation, this is a mutational change, an evolutionary change which happened over tens of thousands of years when the ice ages retreated after the last glaciation. So there we're talking about thousands of years. So some will be hundreds of years, some will be thousands, some will be millions. But actually, I think most of the information today is showing that actually evolution can be a lot faster than we used to think it could be. We can talk in terms of thousands of years, not necessarily millions of years, for some important changes.
But how about the chance of mutation or the rate of
mutation? Yeah, mutation can be measured. The rate of mutation was a very controversial area for a long time because it was very, very hard to measure mutation. Now with DNA sequencing being so easy and relatively cheap, it can actually be measured. And the way that it gets measured, it's usually in medical studies. You can sequence the DNA of a mother and a father and the child. And then you can see, are there any DNA changes in the child which are not there in the parents? And that gives you an exact count of how many mutations are happening. And the studies of that which I've seen, there was a very large study done in families in Iceland, counted that on average, most of us in the room will have about 50, somewhere between 50 and 100 mutations which were not there in our parents. So it's quite a lot.
Good afternoon, Professor Holland. Thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask, because nowadays we have some gene-modified product, we have some technology about it, and I want to know if it is possible to create a new species artificially. Thank you.
Yes, so the question is whether we can create a new species artificially. And the answer is clearly yes, there's no doubt about that. Because what we mean by a new species is a population of organisms which were not capable of interbreeding with a different, let's say their parent population of species. And the sorts of things that can stop things interbreeding could be rearrangements of the DNA, changes in the chromosome structure, rather large-scale changes to the DNA, or sometimes small mutations which affect behavior or chemical sensing between individuals. This is something which is pretty simple to do with modern technology. So the answer is definitely yes. Whether we want to do that is a slightly different question, but your question was, is it possible? And the answer is yes.
And I have another question is about the mass extinction. Do you think that due to our human behaviors, we will cause another mass extinction?
Yeah, I mean, the evidence is controversial, but it has been estimated that the rate at which we're losing species at the moment is faster than is normal. By normal, I mean pre-industrial rates. It could be argued that is a mass extinction event. Actually depends how you define the words mass extinction. But there is certainly extinction happening because of human activities, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. So could you please tell us your opinion about creationism as compared with evolution?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I come from a country, the UK, where Charles Darwin is our national hero. And I haven't met many creationists in my life. I've only met one or two. And so I haven't had those discussions very often. But my view, I'm a scientist, and I like to believe in evidence. And in my view, there is an enormous amount of evidence for evolutionary biology, so much that it isn't a theory, it isn't a hypothesis, it's a fact. Because it's the same fact as gravity. I mean, if I drop this, I know it's going to go down. I know it's not, well, it might. I'm going to let go, and we're going to see if it goes down or up. But all the evidence suggests it's going to go down. And to my mind, evolution, it has the same level of proof as gravity. So as a scientist, we have so much evidence for it. And as far as I can see, no evidence at all for creationism. That, to my mind, there shouldn't really be a debate. But that's my view as a scientist.
So we've been talking about the metaphor of the tree of life as some diverging pattern. And I was just wondering, I'm not sure if it's possible, but usually interbreeding between different species would lead to an offspring that's not viable. But in the case that species could interbreed, then would that lead to some changes in the tree where they converge?
Yeah, that's a really, really, really interesting question. Is it always a tree? Because if two species came together, those two branches would fuse. Okay? Now, we don't think that's happened in the animal kingdom. In the plants, there are cases where two species will come together and hybridize. So it's like two twigs, not deep branches, but two twigs coming together and making a new species. We know this has happened within the plants. Within the bacteria, they do this all the time. So the bacterial evolution is a lot less like a tree, but there is a lot more of a mesh of genes being swapped. And right down, perhaps the best example is if we go right back to near the origin of life, early on in evolution, there's a very, very clear case where two large branches came together. So we know now that in the earliest stages of life, there were three main branches called the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryotes. But actually, the eukaryotes were not necessarily a whole branch on their own. They came from fusing of other branches, and we're eukaryotes. So we know that this branch fusion happened very early on in evolution, and fusion of twigs has been happening in some groups later on, but probably not in animals. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question.
Hi, Professor Holland. I just want to ask, why in a lot of studies or teaching showing that the common ancestors do not exist now? Are there any evidence that any common ancestors are existing currently, and why, for example, if not, why is this the case?
Well, I think there are, but let's look at the question a little bit in a slightly different way. By definition, if time has gone on, the ancestor should not exist now. It should have gone extinct. We do find fossils which look exactly as we would predict for ancestral forms. There's no doubt about that. The idea in Darwin's time, people talked about missing links. There really aren't any missing links now. We have fossils for nearly everything that's important. So that concept is pretty much gone. The common ancestors shouldn't exist today because their common ancestors, all those ancestral forms should, by definition, be extinct. The exception to that is sometimes in speciation, one species could sort of come from there may be a large population of a species, and a small population gets separated and undergoes some change and becomes a new form, while the larger population doesn't change very much. One could argue that the large population then is the ancestor of the other. And that does exist. There are lots of examples of that. So, for example, in the famous case of Darwin's finches, there's radically changed finch forms on the Galapagos Island have perfectly ordinary finch relatives on the mainland. So there are many cases like that. So I don't think there's any issue there.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Good evening, Professor Holland and Professor Hui. I'm confused about the problem of eugenics. Some people said that some species should be eliminated in the process of evolution because some species are not evolved enough. They think some species are not strong enough to survive on this planet, so they have to be eliminated. And I'm so confused about, is it important for all the species to exist on the Earth?
This is really a question, an ecological question. We don't necessarily know what contributions each species is making to the health of the planet. I've heard people say, do we really want mosquitoes? They transmit diseases, they bite us, they're annoying things. If we killed all the mosquitoes, they're the food item of many fish. They're the food when they're larvae. They're food item of many birds when they're adults. Each species is contributing in some way to the ecosystem. We don't necessarily know all those interactions. So I would say it would be very irresponsible of us to make decisions about what species should be on the planet. No, I think we should keep what we have.
I have another question about the DNA. And you have mentioned about DNA is the key to solve the problem of which species is related to which species. Do you think, is there any new key to solve this problem that we haven't discovered rather than DNA?
That's a very interesting question. Let's look to the future of science. I don't know. DNA is a very special molecule because it is the information carrier between the generations. It's not only that it's a very complicated molecule, there are lots of complicated molecules, but DNA is a special one because it is actually the information which is inherited from one generation to the next. So I don't think there is a better source of information to work out who is relation to whom. I do think we can improve our technical methods for studying it, for sequencing the DNA, and for analyzing it. It's mathematically and computationally very hard to do the analysis from the information. We need to improve that, but I actually think DNA is going to be the best and most informative molecule for this question.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes.
Hello, Professor Holland. Thanks a lot for your talk. Your talk, the title today is The Tree of Life, an idea that changed the world. But I don't quite get the idea how this idea changed the world. Would you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, certainly. I think it changed the world in clarifying where we as human beings see our place in life, see our place in the planet. If we think back to 200 years ago, I think it was pretty common for human beings to think that they owned the world, that they were in charge of the animals and plants, and that we were looking after the animals and plants, and that they belonged to us and they were there to serve us. Seeing our place in the tree of life just makes us recognize that we are one twig in this huge tree. We're no more special in evolution than a beetle or a centipede. We are just one twig. We are more special in one sense, which is that we have the ability to look after the planet if we want to. That's the only way in which we're special. So I think it did I think the Tree of Life changed the world in changing humans' perception of where they fit, where they fit in relation to all the other living things.
Well, I said that many of us, or at least many people, still think that we rule the world.
Yeah. The world is not there for us, would be my response to that. If we were not here, the world would carry on perfectly well. So I think because of that, I really don't. I think we have the ability to change the world. That's true, but that is different from thinking that the world is there to serve us. Because I clearly think that we are just one very recent twig in the history of evolution on this planet, and we have no special place because of that.
Thank you.
Okay, so if yes, of course.
Thank you, Professor Holland, for your insight into evolution. You mentioned about DNA being such an important part in clarifying many things about evolution. But with DNA technology, there has been intervention in the genetics by DNA technology, and it seems to be growing in the next generation. As in, like, people are like genetically modifying babies. There have been talks about it. So how would that now, because it's not natural selection now, it will be more like sort of like artificial selection. So what do you, as an evolutionist, as an expert in evolution, I was wondering what do you have your opinion on that part of the science?
I think we have to, the first and most important thing to recognize is that if we do genetically modify organisms, they will pass on that information to the next generation and the next generation. We have changed evolution when we do that. There will still be natural selection, because what we've done is put a mutation in, and natural selection may get rid of it. But we are influencing evolution when we do that. I don't think that's necessarily a wrong thing to do. I don't think we should run away from that. But I think we have a duty to understand properly what we're doing and have a public and open debate about it, so that lots of people have their opinions on this. We have to realize that that is what will be happening. And genetically modified plants and animals are being made, and we have to understand what that means. Yeah.
Shall we just take one or two more questions? In that case.
Thank you for the lecture of Professor. I would like to ask why the basal phyla did not experience much evolution, while the others experience a few evolution and some mutation and extinctions.
I think they did experience lots of evolution, but we're looking at it from a rather biased point of view, because they don't have a brain and arms and legs and walk around like we do, but they have lots of specializations that we don't have. So these jellyfish, for instance, have invented a new cell type called a nematocyst, which has this, it's like a harpoon, a fast, rapidly firing cell which can sting another organism at a super fast rate. We can't do that. So they have been undergoing their own special type, special evolution. So it's not as if they haven't been evolving, but they have their own specializations. Yep.
Sorry, but what I mean is, why is the basal phyla is a specific branch on the tree of life, while the others maybe they are the branch of the branches?
Well, we're only calling them the basal phyla really because there are fewer of those species. Perhaps another way of looking at your question, let's turn your question around a little bit, which is why have some branches diversified to give lots and lots of species, and some branches not so many species? That's a slightly different way of looking at the same question. We don't necessarily know the answer to that, but one of the key inventions, I really do believe one of the key inventions, which just happened on one branch, was this invention of having, a front end and a back end, and a left and a right, and a top and a bottom. And that is a change in the organization of how the embryo develops, and will have involved using genes in a slightly different way in the embryo. And once that was invented, that gave evolution opportunities to build lots of varieties of different types of animals, and many new species will have come about once those new ecological horizons were opened up.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe I will just finish by asking the last question. So, so apparently, of course, scientists care about science so much. So why should the public, if you're not being a scientist, why should I still be interested in science?
I think all of us have a responsibility to be interested in science. I think there's a number of different reasons for that. One is science is influencing our everyday lives. So if we really want to have an informed debate about the decisions which are made, which affect our lives, then we need to understand the scientific basis of those decisions. And subjects like evolutionary biology are being used, for instance, in engineering, where new products are being built, in medicine, in all sorts of areas. And I think, therefore, I think it's a responsibility of all society to participate in that debate.
Thank you. So I think with that, we will close the Q&A session. But before we end, can we give a big applause to Professor Holland again? And again, we also thank you for coming, for joining this Yan Kok Wing lecture series. Okay? So I hope we'll see you again next year. Okay? Thank you.